Welcome to Safety Spectrum, your environmental health and safety connection. This program is a presentation of the Michigan Safety Conference. For almost a century, the annual conference has provided credible educational opportunities and valuable support to the safety and health practitioner by offering 120 instructional programs along with exhibits highlighting the latest in safety equipment, instrumentation, and demonstrations. To learn more about the conference, please find us at safetyconference.org. Welcome to Safety Spectrum, the podcast for the Michigan Safety Conference. I'm your host, Sheila Ide. The Michigan Safety Conference's mission is to enhance workplace safety and health by sharing EHS best practices, provide education, and create a community of experts to help eliminate workplace injuries and fatalities. Our program today is implementing a best practices workplace violence prevention system. Unfortunately, the threat of violence has become an everyday occurrence in formerly safe spaces. In the workplace, the threat can be particularly ominous considering normal work stresses, a variety of individuals closely involved, and the knowledge that the victims are present at a certain time and place. So what should an employer do to address these issues? Dr. Ken Wolf is CEO of the Incident Management Team, consulting on workplace violence prevention, active shooter survival, threat assessment, crisis management, and executive protection. Often a presenter at the Michigan Safety Conference, he also conducts training under a MIOSHA SET grant. Dr. Wolf has been a violence management and crisis response consultant to the U.S. Postal Service and many Fortune 500 companies. He has helped develop violence protection programs for Intel, HEICO, Lear, Eaton Corporation, and trained threat assessment teams worldwide. He has also assisted in writing the national critical incident programs for UAW General Motors and UAW Chrysler, and has responded to crisis events of shootings, workplace emergencies, and natural disasters. So thank you for joining me today on Safety Spectrum, Ken.
Afternoon.
So how did you get started? I mean, I've known you for years, and I've heard you speak, but how did you get involved in this line of work?
Um, it's interesting. I worked with a lot of law enforcement groups and companies, and for a while I was working with the Wayne County Sheriff's Department, and we trained crisis teams to respond. We responded to the plane crashes and shootings and things like that. We got a page that there was a shooting at the Royal Oak Post Office. So we deployed our team and we were on site in about 12 minutes. And at that time, the Postal Service didn't have a crisis response team. So we worked with John Ball, who is the Director of Public Safety at Royal Oak, and set up a system to do crisis recovery, reduce the impact of trauma. There were 192 employees who were affected by the incident. In the aftermath of that, C.W. Wilson, who was the postal inspector in charge, said, "Hey, Doc, why don't we look at who the perpetrator was?" And we started looking at the background of the individual. And what we discovered was there was a whole trajectory of warning signs over time. He just didn't decide, gee, I'm going to cause harm at the post office. And the post office put together a work group to look at designing a national violence prevention program. And I was invited to be on that task force. And then after working with the Postal Service, I started, and in those days, it was a long time ago. You didn't have CC, you didn't have the Secret Service FBI protocols that fortunately employers have today. So we tried to look at other kinds of events, and that's how I got into studying the behavioral indicators of people who pose threats. And what are some of the precursors? What are some of the warning signs that a company should look for that differentiates somebody who's a poor performer versus somebody who may be on a trajectory of violence, a pathway to violence, as it's now called, to do harm?
It's kind of hard to determine sometimes that we're not actually trained. So many of us are not actually trained to know the difference. We just know somebody's difficult, but we don't realize it may morph into something worse, and that seems to be happening more and more. So, what are best practices regarding the components of a workplace violence prevention program?
What's very interesting is in a lot of our trainings, we often find out that many companies have workplace violence prevention policies. say don't do bad things or these kinds of things may happen to you. But then their policies stop. They've done very little to institutionalize a comprehensive system of the components that you need. Now, the FBI, OSHA, the Secret Service came out with a best practices model, and also the American Society of Industrial Security just came out with a standard that also became an ANSI standard on what are the best practices of a comprehensive program as opposed to a piece of paper. So, in terms of best practices, what you want to have is one, you want to have a violence prevention a statement, policy that defines several things. What are acceptable, what are unacceptable behaviors in both verbal and nonverbal kinds of gestures, anything that you do that results in intimidation of another person in the workplace. You want to talk about having a central reporting system. So any employee, contractor, if they see something that is concerning to them, they know who to call rather than they just, have that information, because lack of early reporting denies the organization the opportunity for preventative intervention. The other things you want to tell your employees in the policy statement is any threats you make, not only in the workplace, but also on social media, if they're directed against the company, will be considered a violation of the policy. And you want to talk about you have a threat assessment team, which sort of becomes the quarterback. So if you have a situation of concern, you know who to call and people will take action. And then you also want to talk about, because you're a caring employer, if an employee sees somebody who's distressed or who's acting in a way that's intimidating, if they call HR, if they call the union rep, if they call somebody in management, we want to help people help themselves. And not just, the knee-jerk reaction is, terminate the person. But if people see that it's going to be a helping, caring program as defined in the policy statement, they'll be much more motivated to call people because they know that they're going to get help. So that's a very critical component to set the tone of an effective workplace violence prevention program.
So it's a culture thing. I mean, like everything else, it's a culture that people feel safe to report things or that they're going to get help if they need it, that they're not just going to be left out there. Because I know there are instances when I was in HR where we had difficult employees. It doesn't mean they were going to do something, but they could be very intimidating. And it back in the day it was kind of hard to come up with how do we deal with some of these folks, like you say, besides discipline and that, but to actually create a culture where people feel comfortable in bringing these things up and know that there's help to be found.
And that's very, very important because everybody says we have a caring culture. And sometimes when somebody's having difficult times, there could be a lot of reasons. There could be situational crises that are affecting them. And, if we look at the landscape of risk in this country, and these are going to affect everybody, there's tremendous polarization politically. How many times did you not want to invite somebody to, Easter or to a Memorial Day, party because you didn't like their political views? When we look at the silos of anger, when we look at the real cost of gas, of mortgage payments, when we look at those incidents of violence in the community, this is on everybody's minds and it can affect their thinking. And just as it affects you, it affects your coworkers, your customers, your clients. And sometimes if somebody has some personal and situational problems and somebody looks at them the wrong way at work, they may overreact or explode. So if that happens, do we have a mechanism by referring them to HR, to the EAP, to try and help people help themselves? And that way you salvage careers. And also, as you were saying, show we have a mission statement that we really care about one another as well as products and services.
Why does an organization need such a workplace violence prevention policy? What should it include in addition to what we already talked about?
Okay, well, I think, as we said, it should talk about what are the behaviors that are unacceptable in terms of verbal and nonverbal behavior. Who do you call if you have a concern? How would we handle reported threats in terms of opening up dialogues, one with the person who's demonstrating these behaviors, but also having public-private partnerships so that if we need to bring in a security response to protect people, we can. So when people see the comprehensiveness of different components, they really have faith in the credibility of the program. And, having a good and an institutionalized violence prevention program and system is kind of like with IRS. Anything is legal if you don't get audited. If you just have if you just have a paper policy and nothing happens, you're fine. On the other hand, if you have an incident, let's take Oxford schools, where the teachers looked at the, reporting the boy on the math quiz. They felt he needed help. And what they did was they brought him in and there were dialogues with the mother. And then it broke down. And, they didn't search his backpack. He went to the restroom and then he caused a lot of harm. And now there's scrutiny from all kinds of constituents. There are lawsuits all over the place. So having a policy and institutionalizing it is really the critical responsibility under the general duty clause, because you want to look at the workplace, and if you see hazards, people hazards now that can cause death or injury, you have to do your hazard identification, hazard mitigation, hazard control, in which case, how do we manage threats when they surface? It's not good enough just to know about threatening behavior. You have to have a system to manage it.
You have to have a plan. You have to have a plan. I mean,
That's correct.
personal issues come up with all of us, things are happening at home, that kind of thing. And just knowing who you go to. And I think a lot of us are not prepared. And there's a certain stigma sometimes in saying that you need help. There still is. I mean, people feel that that's a sign of weakness to indicate they might be having some issues. They know themselves. It doesn't mean somebody else is watching my behavior, but I don't know who. So you also need to have people have a place to go when they're having issues and make it comfortable for them. That's why most EEPs are off site, if I understand that correctly. I think ours was where I worked. So it was they were very careful not to sign it, so that people knew that, oh, we're treating for mental health. I mean, like there's still that stigma out there, unfortunately. So what role does reporting and employee awareness training play?
That's very, very critical, because in best practices of the models that we spoke about, having a policy statement, awareness training, having a threat assessment team, um, you want to train your employees what to look for. What are the behaviors of concern that make them uncomfortable or fearful for themselves or others? And you teach them how to recognize warning signs, who to call, so that the company has a preventative opportunity to respond early and try and help somebody help themselves. When you look at the Secret Service studies of a lot of the active assailant and shooting events, you see that there's a trajectory of warning signs beforehand. Very few people snap, they plan. When I was with the Postal Service, two of the people did a study of employer-directed violence. OSHA came up with 4 types of perpetrators. A type 1 perpetrator is an outsider to the organization who comes in for the purpose of committing a crime. A type 2 perpetrator is somebody who's getting a service and then they commit the person giving the service. You see that in healthcare, where patients attack doctors, where family members attack nurses in the ER, or students attack teachers. A type 3 perpetrator is where the perpetrator is a current, former, ex, or terminated employee. Then they come back for the workplace for the purposes of committing a crime. We call this targeted violence. And the type 4 perpetrator is the domestic violence, where somebody is angry, they broke up with somebody, and they want to get even, And then the predictability of where usually the woman works, the perpetrator knows where to find the target. We just had the shooting at Henry Ford. We had a police shooting in Livonia where somebody was breaking up. So knowing what to look for and who to call gives the organization a possibility for early intervention when we see behaviors of concern that are unsettling to others.
Of course, you don't always know what's going on with someone, especially if they come from the outside. Like you say, the domestic type, the worker may be there, as I said earlier, you know where they are. The person has to be there at this certain time so they can be a target. But how does the employer understand that somebody's having a problem? They're not going to tell you.
Yeah, again, sometimes the coworkers usually see everybody on a day to day. They know them for weeks, months, years, and when they see differences, withdrawal, making threats, writing communications, identifying with extremist kinds of groups, making statements of hopelessness or desperation or anger, or one of the key things you look for is festering grievances. In other words, somebody feels that they've either been bullied, they've been humiliated, they were denied a promotion or a status. The shooter in the Dearborn post office didn't get a promotion he felt he was entitled to. The shooter in Royal Oak was terminated, and these became precipitating events where they crossed the line of impulse control to, commit the crime. But when we looked at the psychological backgrounds, we see numerous complaints, aggressive behavior, threatening behavior that people kind of knew about, but they did not act on. So knowing what these things are and then having a threat assessment team as a core vehicle within the organization to receive reports of threats, open up dialogues with the person who may be distressed to try and help them help themselves while simultaneously looking at the coworkers, the targets of the threats, and putting together a protective plan is an excellent way to have a preventative capability to avoid violent incidents to escalate.
And I think that also covers like the person who is being harassed by someone like a partner or what have you. Their coworkers know that they're acting differently, that maybe something's about to happen because all of a sudden they get, like you said, they get withdrawn. I mean, you were talking about the perpetrator, but I'm thinking that the victim, they could become withdrawn. They could be sharing with some of their coworkers that, I'm really concerned about. And those things also need to be addressed. So those would be warning signs as well, I would think. I had a relative that worked at the post office many years ago, and they said it was a very hostile environment. And it seems odd to think the Postal Service would be a hostile environment, but they said arbitrations went nowhere, union complaints didn't go anywhere, and it was just very controlled situations. So,
There were
yeah.
also organizational variables considering magnifying stresses. In the 90s and late 90s, what was happening was the post office went to tremendous automation. They had letter scanners, letter sorters, and a lot of people felt, what used to be my job may not be my job. So there was, a lot of uncertainty as to what was happening. And that consternation, I think, lowered everybody's or some people's patience as to how secure they felt in the work environment.
What is a threat assessment team and how does it operate?
Okay, a threat assessment team, according to the Secret Service and FBI, and even in the OSHA workplace violence and healthcare guidelines, is a core vehicle for violence prevention in schools, in factories, in any organization. It's a group, a cross-functional team of people who are trained to receive information about threats. The composition, usually you have somebody from HR, from risk management, from legal, from operations, from health and safety, from communications, and sometimes a union member to listen to the kinds of threats that come in. And what they do is once something is reported to them, they do fact finding. They interview the target of the threat. They interview witnesses to the threat. And then they interview the person who made the threat to try and understand, is this, what kind of issue is this, and how can we resolve it through team building, through referrals for anger management to the EAP. And they assess how dangerous is dangerous. Do we need to bring on-site security? Do we need to do team building because there may be conflict? So they take all these factors and they assess them and then develop a threat management plan for the safety of the whole organization. And if somebody has been distressed and they, send them into monitored counseling, EAP counseling, they want to look at, even though they're going for counseling, has their behavior changed in that the aggressiveness for which they were originally brought to their attention changed so people feel safe. If it comes to a separation and they have to orchestrate a high-risk termination, they would orchestrate it in terms of using, security, local law enforcement, and partnerships to try and reduce the impact of trauma of the job loss, but simultaneously protect the workplace. So if the person is one of these low frequency people who wants to come back and get revenge, the workplace is prepared.
So it's an ongoing thing with somebody. Unfortunately, I've had to terminate a few employees, and I always had to put precautions in place. And back when I was doing it, it was unusual to even think that way. But I had code words and this type of thing, and make sure when they leave they don't do this or that. So we are having to learn on the road. Unfortunately, are you aware of any OSHA standards being developed about having violence prevention programs in the workplace?
Well, the first ones came out in the 1990s when, because of the levels of assault in healthcare, nursing, hospitals, community mental health, the first OSHA violence prevention guidelines were targeted towards healthcare organizations.
Okay.
And then it went to social services, and then, it was expanded to everybody else. And OSHA talks about the components we were just talking about. Organizations want to have a policy, they want to have awareness training, systems to report, a threat assessment team, a crisis recovery capability if there's a workplace emergency and or trauma in the workplace, but also to do a site analysis in terms of access control, emergency alerts, emergency notifications. So if there is an intruder, remember we talked about a type 1 perpetrator, that's somebody from the outside who comes in. Um, what kinds of ways do the employees have to notify somebody or shelter in place in order to deal with that kind of intruder, or an intruder who's a current employee or a domestic partner who's now threatening or committing violence in the place? So all these guidelines are available. What's very helpful now, which wasn't available 20 years ago, is if you go to the website of the Secret Service, the FBI, they have all these protocols. OSHA has all these protocols on templates on how to set up a comprehensive violence prevention system. So you operationalize your policy into a real program. And then when employees look at these shootings and they ask, what are you doing to keep me safe as my employer? By implementing the awareness training, systems to report, the threat assessment team, the access control, the emergency notification, and now stop the bleed training, the employer then has credibility to reassure employees that we care about not only services and productivity, but your safety, so you can go home at night to the people you love and to the people who love you.
And I know it's required to have first aid trained people on site. So and the Stop the Bleed is kind of an interesting program. That's what they're starting to teach now, where you don't worry about everything else, but you try to stop the immediate trauma of the bleed. And we actually did a little program on that. So, how does a company institutionalize a workplace violence prevention system?
There are many, many ways that they can institutionalize it, as with many other kinds of health and safety programs. the first thing you want to do is have the program, the policy, and then what you want to do is have periodic trainings, tailgate meetings, staff meetings, and say, by the way, we just want to remind you about our policy. Then what you do is you do different trainings, and they can be for short periods of time on, domestic violence, on, personal problems, on aggressive behavior and how we want to help people. And then you could put things in the newsletter and on bulletin boards. If you see somebody who's distressed, we have a caring system to try and help people help themselves. So by constantly referencing it rather than, the day you get hired, you sign that you read some workplace violence policy in your handbook that's never referenced again, you keep the program alive by discussing it at regional meetings. When you have promotions, you have the new supervisors or union reps go through, a new orientation, and you emphasize we have this workplace violence policy, and this is the team, and this is our response capability. So everybody is aware of what the company has on an ongoing basis.
Um, how should employers, this has been brought up to me before, but how should the employer prepare the employees for those 15 minutes or whatever it takes for help to actually arrive when an incident happens?
Okay, we're talking about when there's an active assailant.
Active
And,
assailant, right, violence, yeah.
you bring up a very good point because if you look at the data, most active assailant shooter events are usually over in 5 to 8 or 9 minutes. So if that's how quick it is, even if you call 911, you don't have time to call a health and safety meeting. The realization is that you and your coworkers are first responders, law enforcement is second responders. So, how do we train ourselves to know how to respond? There are levels of training that you want to think about. One is wherever you are, do you have drills to know how to shelter in place? I mean, why do companies have fire drills? So if a highly lethal but low frequency event occurs, people know what to do because they've practiced it. If there's an active assailant, you train your employees to say, can we understand what is the distance between you and the assailant? If the assailant is outside, you have about a minute and a half to evacuate. Do people practice where the place is to evacuate? If an assailant is, within the hallways or in the shop floor, have you looked at places where you can barricade and shelter in place? When DHS says your choices are to run, hide, and fight, fleeing a kill zone, as long as you don't run into the path of the shooter, is your best survival choice. If you can't run because running will put you in the path of the shooter, can you shelter in place? Do you study? Do you train? Where are there libraries, tool rooms, conference rooms, bathrooms even, where you can barricade yourself out by putting desks, furniture, file cabinets, toolkits on the other side of the door so an intruder cannot come in? If the intruder is unfortunately in eyes distance from you and you can't either barricade or shelter in place, what are your choices? One of the things you want to train for is how do real people respond to active assailant situations. On one hand, you have a fight or flight reaction. On the other hand, you have a freeze reaction. And freezing is you just don't know what to do because you didn't have a plan. So you teach people, if you can shelter in place, do that. If you can flee, you do that. If you have to engage, how do you engage somebody who may have a weapon? Well, you look for opportunistic weapons, a coffee cup, a laptop, a telephone, a cell phone, a pad, anything that you could throw at a perpetrator to make them flinch. Because many of these people are not trained killers. When they flinch and you are not faced with a weapon directly pointing at you, that may give you seconds to either flee because the person's not, focusing a weapon at you, or you may have to engage. And you teach people collectively, maybe swarming, even though it's counterintuitive, is maybe your best survival chance because if somebody has a weapon, and everybody sits, they're stationary targets. If somebody says, let's get up, let's swarm this person, yes, one or two people may get shot or killed, but you just don't allow the perpetrator to go up and down rows as they did in Virginia Tech, shooting people who are offering no kinds of resistance. So when we get that mindset that at some point we may have no other choice but to engage somebody, how can we engage it? You train them if they turn their back on you, if they're reloading. At the Eagles of Death concert in Paris, they heard the automatic weapons going off, and then they realized there was a silence. When they heard the silence, they recognized the terrorists were reloading. At the silence, they then fled, and many people saved their lives that way. So if you train your employees, what are the critical moments and opportunities that they can seize, you maximize a chance of survival. And then the other thing we're finding out is in the aftermath of these events, some of the people who were wounded die from bleeding out. So we train companies how to do stop the bleed training and have kits available for them. So there are a lot of ways you can empower your staff by looking at these events and implementing training before the event occurs so they know what to do and how to do it and when to do it.
I think you said to me earlier that when you freeze, just move, jump, something, because it'll unlock your mind or make you do something. Because if you just freeze, you'll just stay there, right?
That's right. And if you freeze, just say, I'm scared to death. And of course, you're going to be scared to death because these are low frequency events that are terrifying. On the other hand, you want to mobilize yourself. How do you weaponize yourself when somebody is around you with a weapon? Well, one of the things you could do is say, if I do nothing, and freezing is the least effective response because you're a stationary target, think of all the things I'll never do again. I won't go boating and fishing this weekend. I won't go to a card game with my friend. I won't be around when my kid, gets engaged or goes down. And these kinds of thoughts can energize you to either put your energy into fleeing the situation, barricading, and or as a last resort, engaging somebody so that you have a better chance of surviving that situation.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Have you got any final thoughts? I think you said something about EHS individuals being sheepdogs.
We often make the analogy that, when we do some of these trainings, I play a video of sheepdogs, and they say, what has this got to do with anything? What are sheepdogs? They protect the flock. They are the guardians, right? And when the wolves or the bears come, the sheepdogs, go to the threat. They're trained, they're prepared, they're fearless, and they try and, get the sheep to survive. And in the same way, EHS and HR people are like sheepdogs. They say, don't do this, lock out, tag out, and they become the gadfly because they look at risks and they try and protect people from, either external risks, the wolves, and here the wolves are the perpetrators who may come in, but they have a concern for human life. Einstein once said, the world can be an evil place, not because of the evil that men do, but because those allowed them to do it. And by being the sheepdog, HR, union reps, EHS professionals, by looking at what can go, by management having training as to survival, when evil comes to your plant, either from internal employees, domestic partners, or external perpetrators, when people know what to do, you maximize the sense of survival because you had that preparedness for these low frequency but very frightening events. And remember, it wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. The time for preparing for these events is not when you got 15 minutes and there's a bad guy or woman out there. It's setting up the trainings, the drills, the alerts, the awareness of what to look for, who to call, and how to respond that can maximize the survival of your work family.
Excellent. I've worked with Ken for many years, and I know I always learn something when I talk with him, so I appreciate that. Being prepared and assessing potential risk is only part of the picture. How we support survivors in the aftermath of a violent situation, emergency, or disaster is another piece. I'd like to again thank Dr. Ken Wolf of the Incident Management Team for his insights. He can be reached at kwolf, PhD at theimt.org. If you have any questions about this podcast, the Michigan Safety Conference, you'd like to be interviewed or sponsor one of our podcasts, information can be found on our website at michsafetyconference.org. Thank you for listening to Safety Spectrum. This is Sheila Ide.